What a time! I had arranged all of the Season 2 interviews for April, and then lockdown happened, kiboshing all of my plans. Thankfully, some of my interviewees were able to reschedule, and we tried out new ways of recording the episodes. For me, it meant sitting on the floor of my daughter's room and hoping no one would disturb me. One of the people who was able to reschedule was Arike Oke, Director of the Black Cultural Archive since 2019. We talk about her incredible career and the people-centred core values that Arike brings to her work, as well as the resilience required to push forward a challenging agenda of change to an organisation. So today I'm very excited to be speaking to Arike Oke, who's the Managing Director of the Black Cultural Archive. So welcome to the Wonder House podcast, and thanks so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Sushma. I'm super excited to be part of the Wonder House family.
Well, it's great to have you here.
That might be getting above myself. You're like, no, we just invited you in. You're not part of the family.
You absolutely are. You're like number 7, so this is like a very small niche family right now.
Yes.
So, I mean, first of all, huge congratulations on your appointment as Managing Director of Black Cultural Archives, which was only last year. But before we actually talk about your current role, I'd like to ask you a bit about your previous jobs. You've done some really interesting work working as an archivist for Rambert, which is Britain's national company for contemporary dance, and also the collection's development archivist at the Wellcome Trust. They're pretty big jobs, and I was really interested in the way you approached your work, and you challenged the pre-existing narratives that, you know, let's be honest, are usually presented by cultural institutions in the UK. And I just wondered, you know, what underpinned your approach and motivated you when you were working with these very, very different archives?
Well, 2 of my most favourite jobs as well, by the way. I still love both those organisations deeply. But essentially, my first job in archives was when I was a trainee, a positive action trainee, actually, in Birmingham at the Connecting Histories project, which for many years was cited as the seminal project for challenging the norms of archival description and including communities and in trying to diversify the workforce. So that was like my introduction to the heritage sector, was working for what was at the time like a really radical project that was doing things that, I mean, I don't know if you know what the archive sector is like, but it's a lot more conservative than the museums sector. Hyper-conservative sector, which I think they still are struggling to see themselves as hyper-conservative, but they are. To have my first introduction to archives be in that job was just like pretty amazing, and immediately afterwards I just didn't know whether I wanted to be an archivist at all, because I knew that the rest of the world was not like Connecting Histories. Connecting Histories was this wonderful, wonderful, warm, supportive place of people trying to change the world, of archives in Birmingham, but still. So that was, you know, that's the context, right? That the rest of my career is kind of viewed in terms of my archive career. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, it's quite interesting that so many things seem to link back to Birmingham. I mean, when people talk about the past is now, for example, more recently, straight back to Birmingham, and it's having a massive influence across the UK in terms of, you know, how people approach exhibitions, collections, more museum, you know, typical museum collections. And now also you just mentioned this archival project, which I have to say I hadn't really been aware of before. That's interesting. I suppose the thing is that people might assume that museums and archives are really closely interlinked and stuff, but actually they're very separate spheres and they don't often interact, actually.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about BCA a bit later, but in many ways BCA bridges so many different debates, and archives plus museums is possibly something else that we're bridging. But yeah, no, I mean, all roads lead to Birmingham. I love Birmingham. I love London too, but I just feel like I could live in Birmingham for the rest of my days. It's really good. It's got such a good vibe, and yeah, there are certainly things happening in Birmingham that somehow seem easier to do, questions that are easier to ask than in other cities, maybe. I don't know. I mean, you would think, like, all the things that we say that Birmingham is, you would think that Bristol would be doing that, and yet it's not. It's Birmingham that's leading the way. Working class city, what can I say? I'm not from Birmingham, I'm from Hull. But yeah, in terms of Rhombare and Welcome, my job at Rhombare, I mean, genuinely, after I left Connecting Histories, I worked in Hull as audience development, and that was partly, even though in Hull it was with an archive, that was partly because I was just like, I really don't know if I want to be an archivist because of all the things that I've mentioned about what the archive sector is like, with love to my colleagues. And when I came to London, I was still like, I really don't know if I want to do this. I mean, I was applying for audience development jobs with things like Spread the Word and places like, I was really like quite ready to move away from archives. And what made me apply for the Rhombare job, I don't know, I guess it just sounded like fun.
That always helps.
Cool. They're so cool. Like, the Rhombare story is such an interesting one because the company was founded by a lady called Marie Rhombare, who's Polish, but she was actually born Sivia Rambam, and she was Polish at the time when Poland was part of the Russian Empire, and so her language, when she was growing up, she wasn't allowed to speak it, and and her story and how she created this company, and the fact that Rhombare, when she formed this company, was the first ballet company in Britain. It was the first British ballet company, which people think the Royal Ballet is, but the Royal Ballet was a sort of contemporary to Rhombare, but made very different, more establishment choices than Rhombare did. And so, like, throughout Rombare's history, it's always been like adaptable and changing, and it's kind of part of the establishment because it's so old and so respected, so it can't take the same kind of risks as a company like Hofesh Schechter or DV8, those really cool contemporary companies. But even the fact that Rhombare is a contemporary company when it started out as a ballet company, like, they're very interesting is what I'm saying. And when I went for the interview, the chief exec interviewed me, and she now mentors me as well. She's wonderful. She's not the chief exec there anymore. She's retired from there, or moved on from there. But she's this amazing woman called Nadia. And I remember, like, halfway through the interview, she just sort of went, well, my reservations about you are...
Whoa!
Listed, and I was like, whoa, I want to work with her. She's wicked. Like, what a horrible, scary thing to do to someone in an interview. But at the same time, I really appreciated it. It's like, because when you are looking at archives jobs or anything in the culture sector, and you arrive at an interview and you're a black woman, you know that they have reservations and they're not going to tell you about them. And that wasn't her reservation. She had some other reservations about me, but I just loved that she was so brutally honest, and you could see that, like, okay, this is someone with a set of integrity that I want to work with.
I love that. Yeah.
I'm sure you've been, so many interviews where you know when you come into the room, they're like, oh, I don't think this is not the right face for the job.
Yes.
And it's just exhausting. So, like, working for someone like Rhombare with all that energy and, like, all that stuff that I've said about was really, really interesting. It was a very different job than some of my other jobs because it was all about dance, and I'm not a dancer or a choreographer or a dance academic. But the company, the spirit of the company was amazing, and I'm sure it still is. I hope they're doing okay with the pandemic thing, because I think dance is something that is impossible to socially distance. And Welcome, yeah, I think one of the reasons why Welcome wanted me was actually to do with my approach, and they really enjoyed being challenged.
When you talk about your approach, could you tell me a bit more about your approach? What exactly was it that you pioneered actually at Rhombare and that you then took to Welcome and then further developed?
I don't know what I pioneered at Rhombare.
Well, I've done a bit of reading on you, and it seems to be quite a lot.
Crikey. At Rhombare, I basically turned what was technically an archive, because it was a set of collections, into an archive service. So I made it publicly accessible. I made it a professional service. It became the first performing arts archive to get archives accreditation. Yeah, so that's the kind of stuff that I did at Rhombare. The reason I left Rhombare is because It felt like I could just keep doing projects, but I would be making it more and more in my own image instead of it being something that was amazingly relevant to Rhombare and Rhombare's mission. I'd be like, I want to do this, and just being a bit of a kind of Napoleon if I'd stayed, because I'd done so much there. And Welcome, for me, the motivation for going to Welcome was to really learn what it was like in so gargantuan and so well-resourced an institution. Absolute culture change to everywhere else that I had worked. And my approach is always, then and now at BCA, to be collaborative and to think about centering people and communities and stories, and to be ethical, to be radical to an extent. I mean, I'm definitely not the most radical person. I've met a lot more radical people than me, but I'm much more radical than most cultural institutions. And so I was just really interested to see what it was like to work there. And I think for them, they were quite interested to see what it was like to have someone like me there as well. At the time, Welcome so it used to be Welcome Library, which was separate to Welcome Collection, and at the time they had restructured, so the Welcome Library was becoming part of Welcome Collection. They'd made a lot of redundancies. There was a lot of insecurity and sadness in the staff team, and so I think part of the reason they wanted me was to do with them thinking about what it means to be a museum and a library, and what it means to have done that restructure, and how their approach could be challenged and changed. So a lot of Welcome's collections prior to that restructure were about centering the great men of science, which is something that the team at Welcome were quite unhappy with and wanted to change and move away from, and were recognising that they needed slightly different voices and perspectives in the team to be able to do that. Before I left, they had created a kind of inclusion team just for Welcome Collection to question approaches and drive things forward. And of course, after I left, they also recruited Melanie Keane of Innova to be the director of Welcome Collection, which is really exciting. The director of Welcome Collection prior to her was the head of the whole culture and society section of the trust, Welcome Trust. So he was doing both of those roles. And so he's given up the directorship and passed it on to Melanie Keane, which is a really cool development, I think. And it'll be good to see what happens with Welcome going forward. I mean, they also hired people like Claire Barlow. You know Claire Barlow, who curated queer British art at Tate?
Oh, really?
Yeah, so they recruited Claire Barlow to redesign the permanent exhibition at Welcome that had been there since the collection opened, so it was like 10 years old. And I don't know if you're aware of that exhibition that's there now, the Being Human one, how it's basically like one of the most accessible galleries, and it even has like, yeah, it's amazing. So yeah, they were very like deliberate in what they were doing and recruiting at that point.
I think it's interesting when an institution like that recognises that they would like to genuinely change their current approach, and actually to bring in people who are going to challenge what they've been doing so far and actually move them in a different direction. In fact, the direction that they want to move in, because so often it's an institution often wants to say broadly the same. They don't want to do too many experimental things. They don't want to change too much. And it can sometimes just get a bit too, I don't know, same old, same old. So it's quite exciting to hear that. What did you hope to change through working with the archives, the Rhombare and the Welcome archives?
What did I hope to change? Well, with Rhombare, it just felt like the collections were so important and should be shared. I think that's the main thing for Rhombare. I think with Welcome it's a lot more complicated because Welcome has all the money in the world, which is a lot.
It always helps.
But it's a lot of responsibility, right? Like if you have all the money in the world, what are you going to do? And whatever you do has to have a lot of impact. And when I was at Welcome, their mission was to improve health by helping great ideas to thrive. I think that was how it was phrased. I think it was phrased like slightly more patriarchal than that, but essentially improving health, great ideas. which is kind of interesting, and a really nice mission. My job was collections development, which is basically acquiring material. So beyond being like super fun, like going to auctions and having like a welcome credit card, which I still,
Ching, ching.
I literally, I'm still so upset. On my last day when I had to like hand over the credit card, I was just like, no, I'm going to a charity. Can I just keep the credit card? But like acquiring material for the collections it's I don't know, it's just like it's a weird one to just be like, this is how I'm gonna change the world for the better. I don't know. So the sort of collections that I was really keen on collecting were obviously material from people's lived experience and voices that you just don't have in a collection like that normally. And before I left, my colleague Mel, she was the collections development librarian when I was there, we had collaborated on starting a different way of working with artists. Some artists with particular lived experience, including disabilities, we had approached, and it wasn't just about kind of collecting a body of existing work, but it was also about talking to them about what they could create as well, which is quite cool and quite unusual, I think, for archives and museum collections to be able to do that. Over the year that I've been gone, like, Mel's been occasionally kind of sending me updates on what's been going on with those artists. Those are, I think, what I was hoping to change is essentially always including more voices in what we know of the past, and more access to those voices as well.
In this wider context of such different archives, and talking about your practice, I mean, what does decolonising archives mean to you? The $1 million question.
It's a great question, and I always feel like, because I've got quite like a messy personality. Like I do quite like to be a bit of a troublemaker occasionally, if I could get away with it. So, some of my reaction is just like, tee-hee. let's shake things up. Let's see what could be done differently. And part of what it means to me is absolutely what Culture and are looking at, which is like really recontextualizing that word of decolonising. So it's about gaining ground and repatriation to some extent, but that doesn't necessarily mean repatriation to countries. It could be like repatriation to communities here as well, and just opening up ownership of history. So, and also decolonising like the mindset of the people who work in archives, because there's a persistent myth which people have been writing about for decades in journal articles and things about this impartiality of the curator or the archivist or whatever. It's so boring to talk about because people have been debating it for so long, and ultimately everyone goes, oh, it doesn't exist. It's like, of course it doesn't exist. Why should it exist? Why is the debate always around like whether it exists or not? The debate should be about partiality, not impartiality. We all have a viewpoint. The point is that there's a very limited amount of views that are permitted in our archival, our historical, our cultural record of society. And so actually, if we can move away at some point, we're talking about impartiality, and start to think about what views are missing, what views do we want to seek out, what views actually are relevant for different communities, different collections, and how are we going to make sure that we have texture of views and texture of partiality. It's fine to be partial, be upfront and honest about it. There's an archival theorist called Terry Cook, who I don't think is alive anymore, but he's one of my faves. He kind of posited that every time an archive collection is catalogued, the archivist should put their CV next to their descriptions so that you could be like,
oh, I like that.
Oh, that's their viewpoint. That's who they are.
Yeah.
That's why they catalogued it like this. That's why I can't find anything in it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, even something so basic as some people assume that by having say a bit of information either on a database or a label which says bronze object, 19th century, blah blah, that's not impartial. You're choosing to tell a very, very narrow story.
Yeah.
You're choosing to leave out most of the troubling history behind the creation, the removal, the changing way you approach a kind of object. That's not impartial. And I think you're right. I think once we get past the idea that we can aim for some kind of impartial, incredible future, I think the better, really.
But, I mean, impartiality is damaging anyway. Like, if we could be fully impartial, that doesn't help. That doesn't really help. Like, the context is important.
Absolutely. The past is not impartial. Our present is not impartial. Our future is absolutely not impartial either.
Absolutely.
Well, that was such a good answer. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Because it's quite a hard question.
But the thing is, I think people should be aware of this. I think until someone says something like, maybe we should be changing our entire mindset about something, it's so easy just to continue doing what you are taught how to do and the way an institution does things, and actually changing things can be really hard. It's exhausting, unless you find people who are willing to work with you on these kind of approaches and changes and are going to support you through it. Sometimes it can feel like you're just hitting your head against a brick wall and then you leave, either the sector or the institution. And guess what? Even less changes.
Even less changes, because then the institution's like, oh, well, we tried. We tried by pushing all the labour onto this one person, which we thought would solve everything for us.
Yeah, and then we pushed them out. Yeah, well done us.
It's a total trap. And so this is why I have a slight kind of concern about the rush towards every institution having a diversity and inclusion team, because it's not really about one team or one person changing the institution. It feels like a trap for those people who are hired to do the job.
And not least, dare I say it, that a lot of these jobs are temporary contracts. And that speaks volumes again. It's like, for this 1 year, we're going to have this amazing person come and change everything for us. And then back to normal.
They're like, oh, well, we got some funding to do it. That's why it's a short-term post. It's like, well, you shouldn't. That should be part of your course spend. If that's the approach you want to take, which is a weird approach and problematic, but if that's the approach you want to take, it should be from your actual core money, not from a project.
Talking about things like core money and projects, let's move on to your current very exciting role, because you're now the managing director of the Black Cultural Archive. Could you tell us a bit more about the foundation and the history of this organisation, please?
So Black Cultural Archives, originally named the African People's Historical Monument Foundation.
That is a hell of a title.
It's a good title, right? And it's actually still BCA's legal name, but we trade as BCA, Black Cultural Archives BCA. But it's a really important, to talk about the history and the purpose of BCA, it's really important to know that our actual name is the African People's Historical Monument Foundation. We had our roots in the 1980s with the uprisings in Brixton, Handsworth, around the country, New Crossfire, Race Relations Act, rising racism, reports coming out about how the African Caribbean child was being disadvantaged in the education system and actually made to almost work backwards through the system because of the racism against especially young black men, which I think persists, even though I think people wouldn't necessarily see it in exactly the same overt way now, but in terms of attainment of young black men, it's still there. And so those are the issues that a collective of parents and artists and educators and activists, poets, artists, came together in the 80s, and they kind of thought, well, actually what we need is a space of our own. We need a space that could be held for the community to actually document who we are, our culture, our heritage, and our part in the society here. After Windrush, we essentially rebuilt Britain, but the presence of black people in Britain goes back to at least Roman times documented, and even further back on archaeological evidence. So how bizarre to always be on the outside looking in, and how bizarre to never see monuments to our presence. And so that's why that initial title of BCA is so important, that it is a monument, it's a historical monument. And the other reason monument came into it was because there was a visit by Queen Mother Moore, who was Pan-Africanist civil rights activist, and she came to London and really was part of the inspiration to come together in collective action to create this monument that could actually help people move forward with their aspirations by seeing themselves reflected, not only in organisation but also in the collections that we have. So it's really interesting because it takes all of those kind of negative things, and instead of focusing on them, it actually focuses on celebration and preservation, but as a radical act. So that was the foundation and history of it, and that was in the 1980s, and then we opened the doors to our building that we have now. Our address is 1 Windrush Square. We opened the doors to that in 2014. So you can see there's quite a lot of decades in between. BCA was running all of that time, but we didn't have a home. We didn't have a building.
Oh, so where were all the archives and things housed? Where were people working from?
Various places. Right from the beginning, the Lambeth Council has been quite supportive of what BCA was trying to do, and so there were kind of various old shops and old offices that BCA was in. Yeah. Wow. And they're still our landlords. They're still the freeholders of the building that we're in, but we fundraised before my time, but we fundraised for all the renovations to this derelict building that we took over, and it's not derelict anymore, but we paid for all of that from the fundraising that BCA had done, which does include some contributions from City Hall and from Lambeth, but it wasn't their idea. It was the community's action that made it happen. Yeah.
God, that's incredible. I mean, when we first started this, the conversation, you mentioned that you just talked about the 10-year strategy, the 10-year BCA strategy. Pretty amazing, especially given what's going on around the world right now. But, how would you go about formulating your plans for the future of such an important organisation? And especially because I can imagine so many people have so many hopes and dreams and fears for it as well. So, where does your inspiration come from to formulate these kind of plans?
It's really going back to what I was talking about multiple perspectives and bringing people together. So I started at BCA in March 2019, and it's now May 2020. So the lockdown happened just as I was kind of celebrating my anniversary. I said to the staff,
what timing.
I was like, yay, we made it for the first year, team.
Lockdown!
Never mind. Celebrate next year. But pretty much the whole of the time since I started up till now has been having conversations with people, listening to people, talking to people in BCA's building, I got some funding from the Arts Council that gave a bursary for me to travel abroad, so I actually also went to visit some of BCA's extended family, I guess, in New York and Harlem and places like that, and really just spent the whole year just gathering together what BCA's mission and potential could be, because as you would understand from what I was saying about how long it took for us to get the building, so much of BCA's energy has been to get a building. And then when you get the building, you're now an institution. Like, what are you? Like, there's such an identity clash that happens when you've been a radical organisation, a collective, and grassroots, campaigning, and then you get it, and you're like, oh, I'm exhausted. What is that? What do we do now? So
exactly, we've arrived, we have a building, now what?
Yeah, like everyone panic and also fall over. So BCA has done some awesome, amazing things with the building, well before my time with them. But hasn't really had a vision for the future that includes what it means to be an institution, what it means to be a building. And so that's what we've been putting together. So we also refreshed the board about this time last year. I can't remember how many new trustees I got. I think I got 8 new trustees lots of energy, really good, amazing range of knowledge and skills, super cool people. Before I left Welcome, I met a lady called Justine Luterod, who runs the Centre for Synchronous Leadership, and I knew it was going to be quite a difficult and challenging, because I've never run an organisation before. So I asked Justine, can you help me? So she very generously gave me a free place on their fellowship scheme. So throughout the year, she's been like coaching me. And then I also, before joining BCA, again, because I knew it was going to be really tough, applied for the museum's Resilient Leadership programme. Are you aware of that programme?
Oh, that sounds excellent. I am. I've heard of it.
It's so good. And that's an Arts Council programme, and that's actually where the bursary came from to go to New York. When that happens again, the MRL programme, because obviously coronavirus allows kind of shut a few things down, I would absolutely urge everyone to apply to it, because it's just literally saved my bacon. Even on top of like doing things like showing me how cash flow worked. All
this stuff is really important, and people assume that once you become a director of something, you somehow magically acquire all of this knowledge, and it's like, no, you're still the same person. You need to somehow learn.
I know about cash flows. Doesn't mean that when I'm like looking at BCA's cash flow, which to be honest, the layout was just like impenetrable, and I'm like, well, maybe this is what it's supposed to look like. And on the MRL fellowship, I was like, oh yeah, no, I can change it. But one of the course leaders for that, Nick Winterbotham, he actually did a session with me and the board, working out how to put together a 10-year strategy. Until that session, we were thinking like 5 years, and he was like, try 10 years and then you can actually be ambitious. If you do 5 years, it's essentially like an action plan that will probably still include firefighting, will probably still include lots of operational things. If you do a 10-year one, you give yourself a chance to actually achieve what it is you want to do, rather than just being like, okay, in the next 5 years, I'll get a new customer relations management database or something. Do you know what I mean? Like, boring.
Yeah, new photocopiers definitely on the board.
Yeah, exactly. It's like essential things, but not strategic things. So that's how we came about the 10-year strategy. We launched it a couple of days before we're recording this podcast in a public meeting on Zoom.
I did wonder.
It was amazing. We had capacity for 500 people on the type of Zoom that we were using. 500 people signed up, and people were emailing going like, can we please get on it? And I was like, well, we can't afford to expand the capacity. And a lesson for us is that even on Zoom, people sign up for things that they don't attend. So actually we should have oversold it, because in the actual meeting, I think it was like 250, 260, something like that, people came. Which is...
It's amazing still. Yeah.
It's phenomenal. We could never have held that kind of event physically, because we haven't got anywhere big enough to hold that many people.
I just wondered if anybody listening wanted to read a bit more about this 10-year strategy, is there somewhere that they could... Is it on your website, or can I include a link to it somewhere?
It's on our website, blackculturalarchives.org. Hopefully by the time people are listening to the podcast, we'll have also released the recording of the meeting. We included a sign language interpreter called Audrey. We had live captioning in the meeting, so when we release the recording, hopefully it's as accessible as we could make it. And we had 85 questions, I think, submitted during the meeting. So we're also going to try and put together like an FAQ style, trying to answer as many questions as we can when we release the recording.
I think what I really love is the fact that from the very start, when I started asking about your initial jobs, you focused it on people. And I love the way that even now as an MD, it's still the heart of your approach, and even going so far as to include closed captioning, including a sign language interpreter as well. Because I think I'm just trying to think, like, I don't think I've seen that in any online meetings from any big organisations. So the fact that you're sort of living and breathing your approach, I think is really empowering, actually. 'Cause it's so easy to say and go, oh yes, I want a people-centred approach, but it's another thing actually putting it into practice. So I really genuinely admire that.
Thank you. I do really appreciate that especially because I just think BCA, we have to do everything on a shoestring. So I do see it as, in a way, it's something from that I learned at Welcome, because they have all this money, and so they actually, sometimes they move very slowly because they want to think about everything so deeply. They should be able to act quicker than they do because they have all the resources, but they're like, we better think about what's the most impactful. But actually, like, being somewhere where you don't have to think about how much everything costs all the time is actually a really good sensibility to take to a charity, because when you're in a charity you can get sucked into this like famine mentality and always doing everything almost desperately. That's like an oppressed mentality, and what I'm talking about is trying to bring the mentality of privilege where things somehow become like they don't. I'm not talking about Welcome specifically here, but actually when you're in a position of privilege, things are easier to do, not only because of the money, but because your mindset is like, I could do it. Whereas if you're in a famine mindset, you're like, oh, this is so difficult, I won't be able to do it. We'll just, I don't know, we'll just ask people to email us, and then we won't be able to, it's like a really like oppressed mentality. And so I do think that's something that I learned from Welcome, is to like bring this thinking deeply about why you're doing something at the same time as assuming that you can do it and finding a way to do it. And also, proving a concept sometimes. Like, yeah, I actually haven't seen someone do sign language interpretation in a Zoom meeting or a public event apart from ours. But we could do it, and we have no money, so everyone else should do it. Exactly. It makes no sense that no one else is doing it, because it makes absolute sense it should happen in everything. It's a visual medium.
Exactly. I mean, if you're saying you're putting people first, your organisation, you want to be open and accessible to everyone, then isn't this the baseline?
It's a baseline. It's not like that shouldn't be a stretch for anyone. And the fact that we've got literally no money and no resources and we managed to do it should really, guys, pull your socks up.
Make people think. I suppose it's. I had an interesting conversation with Dan Vo about this kind of approach as well. And I was saying, you've had so much positive press and it's really great and all the rest of it. And he said, it's because we actually think about, who and what is missing from the table. And I thought, oh my God, shouldn't that be how everyone works? But obviously it isn't, unfortunately, not yet. I think we're still moving to that point. But just hearing him say it, I thought, wait, of course that's how we should all be working, and I think the same sort of approach here. And it's interesting, it's sort of coming from slightly younger BAME members of the community who are really driving this through. And I really like the way you described, working from a mindset of privilege rather than the famine mindset, because I think that's exactly what we do in the cultural sector, because we're so used to working with very limited resources, very little time, everyone's overworked, everyone's underpaid, and you just end up feeling just exhausted by all of this, and you just think, I cannot do any more, I can't bring any more to this. And understandably, aspirations tend to gradually decline.
Right, and that experience just describes like BCA as an organisation as well as all the people of BCA as well, because of course, the reality is that we're not really in a privileged position. So I'm trying to hold on to and like engender that mindset as much as possible, because to be honest, like when you present with that mindset, sometimes it actually makes people with money give you money. It's really weird. It's really weird. But if you're like asking for money, they're like, oh no. But if they're like, can we give you some money? And you didn't, like, if you just come in with privilege, sometimes that really helps. It's really weird. Like, I almost want to like have a psychologist come and do some work on this, because I think it's something that could be like really helpful for the cultural sector as well as for people of colour working in the cultural sector in that hierarchy of need and oppression.
That would be interesting. I was wondering if I could find someone to interview about that. I shall mull that one over. I like that one. So, we talked a bit about decolonising before, but I wondered, does the idea of decolonising influence how you approach your role as a director of such a prominent and important archive devoted to Black British history?
Absolutely. BCA is such an interesting place because our gaze, our GAZE gaze, is from a Black perspective, but also understanding that is almost like an oxymoron, because what is a Black perspective? Is it someone from first generation from Jamaica, or is it someone second generation Nigerian? Is it someone who is, an NHS health worker? Is it someone who's like from a prominent legal family? Like what? It's like, what? So the question of decolonising becomes even more complex. It's like, do you know those patterns that are fractals, and the more you go into it, the more you see? It's almost like that when you start from a big organisation like the V&A. In fact, it's a much more simple thing for them to think about. But for BCA, it's even more complex than that. It's like, it just keeps going. It's like, there are so many types of colonising that have happened to the people of African and Caribbean descent who are living in the UK now, as well as the people of African and Caribbean descent throughout the history of the British Empire. And how strange, in a way, I mean, we use Black British as a very deliberate positioning for certain reasons to do with our voice and our influence and our direction, but essentially we will and can question British as something that is based in the UK, because the British Empire is actually, in a way, one of the things that we're talking about, as much as we're talking about our ancestral heritage. So I think I'm getting a bit deep, so I'm going to start. I think you know what I mean.
But I think that's really important, actually, to state that out loud,
Yeah.
because it's something that a lot of people, some people will sort of know almost, from their core, but for a lot of other people looking from the outside in, it's not there, and it's certainly not explicit. They won't necessarily realise that. They just assume, Black British Archives,
It's
all right
Stormzy.
then. And just don't... Precisely, because actually, for some people, they will, include, South Asian people in that, Chinese people in that. So I think it's really important that you, set that out really clearly and strongly, and also quite emotionally, because it's, yet again, one of the things that people still either choose not to or can't talk about, and it is deeply emotional. I can't imagine anyone would take a job at the Black Cultural Archives and not feel some emotion at some level in a really strong way.
Absolutely. And I think that's something, we were talking earlier about or at least we alluded to it, the exhaustion of being a person of colour within culture and having a lot of the responsibility thrust upon you. And when I started at BCA, despite it being, quite stressful for money reasons, for the funding of BCA, I was actually felt way better than I have in any other job. Like going into work and seeing other Black people as colleagues, and that being the whole ethos of the organisation, was invigorating, and it gave me life, as much as all the other stuff was Arike, be stressed out. Bizarre, right? But it's a big responsibility as well, of course.
Of course it is, absolutely.
For everyone, not just me, but everyone who volunteers with BCA and is paid by BCA to be a staff member or curate something for BCA. The weight of responsibility is, I think, perhaps too much. And the reason I say it's too much is because we're on our own, and I actually think that there should be plenty of similar institutions. And then it wouldn't be that everyone looks to BCA to fulfil everything right now, right? There should be a Black British Museum. There should be a ton of them.
There was some really interesting conversation with Bonnie Greer and people like Miranda Lowe and Patricia Camper about this at the British Museum a few months ago now, although that, I have to say, after lockdown, it feels like a lifetime ago.
I can't believe that was this year. It's so weird.
I know! exactly, literally a couple of months ago,
So
and it just,
freaky.
I know, life has changed so much. But I think it's nice that these kind of conversations are being made much more prominent, and people are talking. Well, they seem to be talking less about, oh my goodness, what a strange idea, and more, oh wow, this is a really exciting idea. How do we make this happen? How do we work together to make it happen? And it seems like such a massive shift in mindset. And I wonder, it feels like something that could only start happening now. I think in the, I don't know, maybe the last 5-10 years, I don't think people were quite ready for that yet.
I don't know. It's kind of like, the connecting histories thing. That's what we were trying to do, and it was super frustrating, like, after connecting histories, that for years everyone was going, like, in the archive sector, like, connecting history is a seminal project. I'm like, you can't still say it's seminal, like, a decade later. But I see what you mean. I do see what you mean, but yeah, I just feel a bit grumpy about how long it takes to do anything in Britain.
Oh, God, in the cultural sector generally, everyone talks about the glacial change in the museum and cultural sector, and it really is.
This is what I mean about, like, my messy personality, though. Like, I'm just not okay with that. I just think that's just like, not you, but I just feel like that's an excuse. Like, when the people who have the power to make change say, this glacial, well, it takes a while. Like, no, it really doesn't. And, the pandemic is an opportunity to have interesting conversations and to have policy made quickly. Unfortunately, the pandemic also means that we're all struggling with, things that are happening in our personal lives, or, if you have children, you're trying to work and look after your kids, or if you've been furloughed, then you've got all sorts of other problems to deal with in terms of, like, worrying about the future, or feeling like if you found identity within your job, like, what does that mean now, and what can you be doing positively? So even though the pandemic is such a great opportunity to make change quickly, we also have to try and navigate and negotiate that we're still humans, and but I just still think, like, so much is happening so quickly that was never possible before, because people thought that we'd have to do massive projects to be able to get things online and blah blah blah, but actually we don't. We could just do things quickly.
It's amazing what you can do when you have to do it. I think for me that's what it's shown me. Yeah.
But I'm not going to get
No,
I just say
please carry on. This is about you.
The cultural sector, like, the cultural sector has to make this change. So how can they keep ignoring diversity? How can they keep ignoring decolonial practice? How can they keep sort of turning it into short-term funded projects? No, it's an essential change that has to happen now, so just get on with it.
Yeah, I think it's just too easy to sideline it, and that's what people are doing. It's a niche project, and it will probably have its moment, and then we can carry on as normal afterwards. Give it another few years, maybe. I mean, that's the kind of message that I tend to get, when people talk about it. And it's like, my God. And it's one of the reasons, actually, I started this podcast, because I thought, you know what, this isn't going anywhere, and we are going to share this information, and I want to embed it in our organisations, and I want people to feel empowered to try this in their organisations, even if it's, just one person giving something a go. That can lead to, quite massive changes in the long and short term. So you got to try, because at the end of the day, it's all about being open and honest about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you're doing it with. And shouldn't that be the fundamental part of our collective approach to our jobs, surely?
Being open and honest.
Yeah,
I agree. I totally agree. I just think the higher up you go in terms of influence and power, that possibly starts to drop off.
Possibly. I think I'd leave out the word possibly.
Yeah. Well, probably. In the MRL course that I was talking about earlier, we'd have these, like, presentations and things, and one of the slides that really entertained me was, I think it was a picture of Groucho Marx, and it says, "Here are my morals. If you don't like them, I've got some more."
I like that.
It kind of kept coming back and back, because a lot of MRL is, about how to it's about resilience, so a lot of it's about, negotiating and things like that. And I see it coming up in the pandemic response as well. Like, the whole U-turn of the government over people in the NHS who are not technically British citizens having to pay a surcharge for their own healthcare, which is crazy. And I just did a big U-turn on that. I just kept thinking, like, here are my morals. If you don't like them, here are some other ones. But the reason I thought of that,
change.
Yeah, the reason I thought of that was, what you were saying about being honest and open, and how that sort of drops off the further up you get in influence. Like the Nationals, they, as a condition of their direct funding from government, have government on their boards, which isn't to excuse those people, but it just sort of show you that you are less able to take radical action the more you accept certain things like direct funding from government. And it's something that BCA will actually have to think about at some point, because we do keep lobbying for direct funding from government.
Ooh, interesting times ahead.
Well, they haven't said yes. They keep saying no.
Yet.
But we have to ask. And but if they actually say yes at some point, I think we'll have like that little Groucho Marx moment where we've got to figure out, like, what does that mean now? What does that mean now about our voice and how we use it? And can we still be radical if we take this money?
Do you know what would be really interesting? If that goes through, I'd love to interview you in a few more years. That would be a very interesting conversation. I could replay certain chunks to you and say, hey.
I'll be like, right, so my approach is completely, and then you'll just insert like whatever the party in power's manifesto is.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, someone else can run BCA if we do that. Because the survival of the organisation is more important than the individual running it for BCA.
That's an interesting... Yeah, I mean, I can't think of many other people who would say that. It just goes to show how valued you must be by the organisation to be able to say that. That's really cool.
Oh, thank you. Oh, interesting. Well, the board did send me some flowers.
Oh, that's nice.
Oh, thank you. For my anniversary at BCA, I got some flowers. It's super nice of them.
That is really lovely. Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Oh. Hardly anyone sends flowers. That's cool.
Oh, so nice of them.
So I was actually looking through your the catalogue collection pages on your BCA website, and I have to say I was genuinely taken aback by the sheer breadth of material you guys have got relating to black people in the UK, and it's over hundreds of years. And I made a note of some of them. So there's archival information relating to individuals like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and events such as the Brixton Uprisings, which you've mentioned, and pretty much everything in between. And I didn't realise this, but you also have the Runnymede Trust's library and archive as well. So it's really mammoth. How do you even begin working with and sharing this incredibly diverse archival material? And especially, I think, when so much of it is so emotive.
So much of the reason that there's such a breadth of material is down to the generosity of the community. So it does come from the community. It's, the elephant in the room obviously is always about the resources that we have to spare or at all to begin working and sharing with it. Some of the conversations that are very much alive at the moment is that we feel deeply concerned that with the closure of our building, access to our research resources, our collections, is cut off. It's so many of our collections are modern collections, which makes it much harder to share online because of data protection and copyright. If you'd asked me this before the pandemic, it would probably be like a very different upbeat answer, but because of the pandemic, we do feel really worried at the moment about the research that isn't happening with our collections because people can't access the collections. And I'm really interested in trying to figure out whether we can make some kind of virtual reading room, like if there was a way of repurposing Zoom or something so it could be a reading room for researchers. the issue is, people being able to screenshot, particularly because, in some of the collections they're very sensitive about individual people. So yeah, so that's an issue that we're looking at the moment. We have a really nice relationship with Runnymede, and we have a funding bid in it. It's the most used collection actually at BCA, and most requested, and we've got a funding bid in at the moment to try and get some help to catalogue the new parts of it. It's really interesting, the Runnymede collection, because it goes beyond what our primary collecting principles are, because of course it's not only about African and Caribbean descent people. These are just like little things that I'm saying about it, because it's difficult to even begin talking about how we begin working with and sharing. But I just wanted to highlight that we have collections around Black-led mental health services and Black people in mental health, but also Black mental health researchers, and we have a funding bid in at the moment to do more with those collections. But one of the collections is by Melba Wilson, who's she's actually like you guys should Google her after this. She's a leading light in Black mental health, but also in mental health generally, and has done, like, her career spans leading public health initiatives around Black and minority ethnicity people's mental health. However, when I was writing the funding bid, I went onto my old employer's website, Welcome, and just to look up like what they had in their collections about Melba, because she's written a lot of books. They don't have a single thing. How bizarre. She's like one of the leading researchers. How weird. And that says a lot in itself, not especially about Welcome, but especially about Black mental health and how it's considered, right? And why the collections at BCA are so essential for research. There's so much at BCA that isn't collected elsewhere, even when it's published material. Bizarre. We have a new collaborative PhD studentship with the University of Roehampton, and their doctoral candidate, Karima Ali, is going to be working on Melba Wilson's collection at the end of this year. When we have access to our building again, she can start.
Oh, how exciting.
Yeah, so it's really exciting. So Melba's collection is going to get out there more. And then the last thing to say on that, which is relevant to your question, is that Melba herself volunteers in the archive to help us with the collection. So this is the thing, like, in terms of how do we begin working with them, often the donors and creators of the collections are actually working on the collections themselves. Because, as you say, it's like...
That's phenomenal.
I know, it's amazing, but it is emotive and it is important and it is, like, essential, actually. These are not, like, necessarily, nice to have collections. So.
No, but they often shed the most interesting light on our history, actually.
Right.
Because it's all too easy to share all the happy, clappy, lovely things, and it's all too easy to, brush everything else under the carpet. So the BCA has its physical presence in Windrush Square in Brixton. So how do you plan to sort of share the collections and stories beyond London to the rest of the UK? And I appreciate that's a really difficult question to ask someone in the middle of a pandemic.
Yes, it is.
Sorry.
Lol. How do we plan to share the collections beyond London and the rest of the UK? Well, have a look in our 10-year plan, our 10-year strategy, and you'll see that a lot of our outcomes, our key outcomes, is to share the collections in person, touring, and online. So one of the things that we've done while I've been there, it started before I began at BC, I just finished it, was our Google Arts and Culture platform, which is g.co/Black Cultural Archives, just g.co/Black Cultural Archives. So if you go to that, you can see that we've made the first all year round, not just for Black History Month, internationally accessible platform for telling the stories of Black British history. It includes galleries about the uprisings, it includes a gallery about Windrush, it includes galleries about Black British feminism and dance. It's really cool, and it's something that we can keep growing.
That's incredible, thank you.
So that's our starter, and we'll it's something that we want to keep doing. Everything's funding dependent at the moment unless we get a mysterious benefactor that gives us.
Oh, they're always very, very, very welcome. Yeah, anytime, that's fine.
Yeah, if you're listening, mysterious benefactor.
So I only have 2 questions left for you, but I think they're quite tricky ones.
Oh.
So, but they're still there. So, what advice do you have for people who are sort of working in the sector and they want to bring change to their organisations? And I think especially when it comes to foregrounding collections and stories connected with Black British history. And the reason I'm asking is because it can take quite a lot of courage and a phenomenal amount of energy over months or years or decades to try and persuade your colleagues and institution that it's not only a good idea to work in this way, but this is how we should be working.
It does take a lot of energy over months and years, and it can make you pretty cynical. So my main advice is to always look after your own mental health and your own well-being. I think you've got to do that first, because it can be debilitating to do that work. That's a lot, and it's worth doing, absolutely, but you really need to look after yourselves, because since working in collecting histories onwards, I really have seen the toll that it takes on people. So that's the biggest advice, like, absolutely look after yourselves. And part of looking after yourselves is joining things like Museums Detox.
Yay!
Right? Because don't try to do it on your own.
Yes, completely agree. And in fact, that's where I first met you. It was at a Museum Detox gathering in summer. I think last summer, and it was at the Guildhall Art Gallery. Yeah,
that was such a nice one. Oh, it makes me so sad that we used to be able to have gatherings. Anyway, forget the pandemic.
Yes, I know. But it'll happen again. It'll happen again.
Yeah, I think my advice is all around resilience, right? So look after yourself. Make sure that you're making space for yourself. Like, doing this kind of work, because it's almost like a vocation, similar to a feeling of a vocation, because it's so important, means that it can take over your whole life and all of your mind. And the fact that it does take a lot of courage, and it does take a lot of energy, and it does take a lot of time, means that it can really affect your well-being. So your personal resilience, but part of looking after yourself, again, is having networks around you, finding allies. And sometimes finding allies is about finding someone whose voice gets listened to and getting them to speak. One of the reasons why I told that story about Nadia at Rambert in that job interview, where she was like, well, my reservations about you, Arike, blah, 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 is because I was like, I can trust her. And it proved to be the case. I wouldn't have been able to get anything done at Rambert without her support. She was the chief exec. Find someone you can trust that gets it, and use them. You're being used. You use them. It's fine. They'll like it if you could trust her.
No, I think that's really good advice. Actually, I hadn't really thought of it like that before, but I think that's what I sort of do, sort of instinctively, sort of find the people I can and really want to work with, and gradually see what works, what doesn't work, who will help and support you, and help move your ideas forward. And I think the other thing is sort of I don't claim absolute ownership of my ideas. I mostly just want them to happen. So I don't feel very territorial about sort of saying, look, this is the thing I really want to happen. Just because it doesn't always lead back to me, it doesn't mean I still don't want it to happen, and I will let go of certain things just to ensure it just moves ahead. And I'm like, fine, that's it, I'm done now, thank you.
Exactly. And that won't suit everyone, right? Some people are made to be Madonna the pop star style figures who are like, it's me, it's all about me. However, if you can at all not be territorial, that's a massive help in getting things done, because actually, you know, some people genuinely like have more power and influence than you, and if you give some things away to them to do, it'll get done.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that for everything, obviously, but for a couple of, you know, key little things, I think you sometimes have to make the decision in real life. Do you either want to get it done, or do you want to maintain ownership of it? And unfortunately, in real life, it sometimes means letting go, and that can be fine sometimes. Not easy.
I think that's a really good way to put it, the way that you phrased it there. Sometimes it's more important that the thing gets done than about whose idea it was. Yeah, that's really good advice.
I think that oh, thank you. Sometimes happens. So the last question is one that I sort of emailed you about before, because I wasn't sure about even asking this question, and I sort of mulled it over and eventually got in touch. So, you know, I did quite a bit of background research for this interview, read a lot of articles, and I noticed that pretty much every single person asked about or focused on your Black heritage. And I wondered, how does that sort of question make you feel?
I think you asking that question is really interesting, because no one thinks about that. No one that interviews me thinks about that. In terms of how it makes me feel, I don't mind, because I don't really. I'm quite a private person anyway, so I wouldn't necessarily be looking for them to know every detail about my heritage and my life and my family. But my white English heritage is super important to me, and I do actually talk about that in the same breath as I talk about my Nigerian heritage. You know, I'm working class on both. In both parts of my heritage, and I'm really proud of that, and both parts of my family, and a lot of my personality comes from my white grandma. So yeah, I don't know, it's kind of fascinating, and I'm kind of a people watcher anyway, so I find it interesting that people choose to ask more about, you know, how Black are you? Essentially, that's what they're asking.
Yeah, absolutely.
How Black are you? Well, depending on who's asking. Like, some people are just asking the where are you from question, which is
God, yes,
totally fun
that's
to
a fun one, isn't it?
I
Thing is, I always just say Leicester, and at that point they're like, no, where are you really from? And I'm like, Leicester.
Yeah,
just to really rile them up a bit.
It's just such a stupid question, because, like, Britain's an island. It's literally been through waves of migration. People coming, going. Like, where are you from? The planet Earth. Which is, such a pointless question. But what they're trying to ask is, like, I'm not racist, but I want to know, like, where your colour's from. And then some other people ask it as, like, how Black are you is the question that they're asking. And I don't mind answering either question, to be honest, like, but obviously they're not super interested in the white part of my heritage, which isn't, like, super white anyway, because my whole family are from Hull, which is a port town, and my white grandma called our family, like, Heinz 57 or something, because
oh my God.
some of my cousins are, like, Pakistani English, it's like, and I'm Nigerian English, so whatever.
Yeah, no, I just thought that was interesting. It's one of the things that, like you say, people just ask. They have their own preconceptions and they've got their own ideas behind it, but they won't ever reveal those overtly. They'll just sort of make it part of the conversation. You're like, wait, what? How? What? Huh? And it just comes out of nowhere. And I know for me, I just find it really jarring sometimes.
Yeah, it can be. It can be very jarring when it completely comes from nowhere. I don't know, the sort of, because of my job, I get asked it, like, a lot, so in a way I sort of don't even hear it that much anymore, that question, and I just answer it however I feel like, which is sometimes, like, Hull, and sometimes, like, my dad's Yoruba. So it depends who's asking to what I think the answer is that they're looking for.
It's fair enough. Thank you very much for agreeing to answer that question. I really appreciate it. I think my reasoning partly behind it was just making other people aware that, you know what, think about what you're asking and why you're asking it. You know, don't just sort of assume that it's completely okay to say, hey, you know, and sort of ask these sometimes really stupidly phrased questions. I just want to somehow make people a bit more aware of what they're doing sometimes, because I have a feeling that a lot of them just they aren't. They just assume it's an okay thing to ask and talk about, and impose that on the person they're talking to. And sometimes, you know what, it's not okay.
It's not, because it's exoticism for a start. That's why they think it's okay, because it's like you're an exotic object that should have a label next to you at the V&A. So, you know.
No, completely agree. Thank you. So that was absolutely wonderful. It's been so great talking to you, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do it, because I can appreciate how busy you must be right now. Because unlike me, you're not furloughed. No. I'm furloughed and chilling out at home at the moment.
No, thank you very much for asking. I'm so delighted, honestly, and it's really nice to have a chance to have a good chat with you.
That was me, Sushma Jansari, talking to Arike Oke, Director of the Black Cultural Archives. For me, one of the key messages that came out of my conversation with Arike was about mindset. As Arike notes, it is all too easy to adopt, often without realising, a famine mentality that automatically imposes limits on what you think you can do with the resources you have available. Instead, Arike emphasised the importance of a mentality of privilege, which involves thinking deeply about why you are doing something, assuming that you can do it, finding a way to do it, and finally proving a concept. We recorded this episode in May 2020 before the Black Lives Matter protests erupted in the UK. I talked to Arike about the BCA's response to these protests and much more in episode 8 of The Wonder House.